First, I want to begin by saying, obviously, I'm not the expert on this business that you are up to. Fortunately, I've had a lot of help to put this presentation together. It's been a lot of fun for me because in my life, as I've gotten older, I've become more and more passionate about biological conservation and trying to protect the species in any way we can through sustainability, through conservation for the generations to come. We've been blessed with what we have. So I've had a lot of people help me, and I want to acknowledge that up front. First, Dave Haddock, who's a speechwriter at the Smithsonian, who loves biological conservation as much as I do. And then there's Chris Helgen and Steve Monfort and John Krause and all the great people at the Smithsonian, Pierre Comazali, who are great people at the Smithsonian who are dedicated to this concept and making it work. And I say that in particular because if I make a mistake that's a technical mistake, you know who to blame. I want to say thanks. I also want to say thanks to all the people who run this conference, to Tom and to Tony and all the folks who run your program. For a person coming in from outside, I've given hundreds of speeches at hundreds and hundreds of conferences. This is one of the best I've ever been involved with. Your folks are just fantastic. You ought to give them a big hand. They are fantastic. So the talk is going to be divided into 4 parts. And the first part is going to be about my home. And I grew up in a small town, as I'll show you, Douglas, Georgia, in the southern part of Georgia, in the coastal plain, which is really the same area, the same geologic province that you have here in Jacksonville. For those of you who went to the White Oak Plantation on your field trip, you went by a little town called Hilliard, Florida. Hilliard's named after my great-great-grandfather. My folks have been in this area since the early 1800s, when really it was just becoming a European part of the world as opposed to a Native American part of the world. So I have a long history in this area, and I have a passion about trying to protect what is left of the natural environment here in South Georgia. So it's going, though, to be an exemplar, hopefully, for all of us as to what humans or how humans play a big role in the equation of biological conservation. You can't ignore humans if you're going to talk about biological conservation. And so I want to use that as the exemplar of what we're doing locally and regionally. Next, I'm going to kick it up to global, and we'll talk about the impact that humans are making on the world. And that obviously brings you into questions such as climate change and issues of that sort. Then I'm going to shift gears and talk about the Smithsonian, where we have attempted to really reorient our efforts at the Smithsonian towards biological conservation to have a bigger impact on what we're doing and on the world. And because I think you have to today, otherwise things will be as they are today. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about what we all should be doing in regards to biological conservation. We all have a role, we all have a place that we have where we should take part in the effort to save what we have on this planet. So let me go to the first slide if I can. Of course, the talk title, as Tom said, a new era for biological conservation, primarily a Smithsonian view or a Wayne Clough view to some extent. So let's start off with a little bit of history. So Becca mentioned Viola Shawns, and she was a great curator at the Smithsonian for many years. She was your treasurer for 23 years. And this is the picture of your first meeting, April, oh, sorry, didn't mean to do that. Come back. April the 4th in 1919 at the Smithsonian. There were 57 people in this picture, and 15 of them were women. I understand 10 were spouses, but 5 were charter members of this organization. And Viola is right there under that hat, and very prominently recognized. As an engineer, I did have to notice that they chose to take a picture right where there's a wonderful big crack in the building. And I suppose that was symbolic because the Smithsonian still has deferred maintenance problem. But Viola was right there from the very beginning. Well, let's move on now to the, if I can get that next slide to go. There we go. There she is. She was curator of mammals. And she had a very important position at the Smithsonian for a very long time. And as I said, she served as your treasurer for 23 years. Now, Garrett Miller, who is also an active curator of mammals at the Smithsonian, was your vice president. So the Smithsonian has deep roots with this organization, and I understand for your 100th anniversary, you're going to go back to the Smithsonian, and that's a wonderful, wonderful idea. Now we're going to shift into the part of the story about South Georgia, my home there in South Georgia. I grew up in a town called Douglas. It It was named after Stephen Ambrose Douglas, the senator from Illinois. That's another story as to why they would choose a northerner to name a town in the South. It was named in 1858. The county was named Coffee County after John Coffee, who was a gentleman who earned the title of general at one point in his career as a, quote, Indian fighter back in the 1820s and before that. Not clear how much Indian fighting he actually did, but he did earn that title. There was another General Coffee who fought with Andrew Jackson, who really was in that category. This guy was a little bit less so. He probably earned a little more distinction because he served in Congress. And if you look at this plaque, it says he served for 3 years. A little hard to serve in Congress for 3 years. So the deal on this was he was elected and served served one term in Congress for 2 years. He ran for office, and he died, but he was still elected. Now, the reason that happened was in those days it was hard to get the news from Washington back to South Georgia. And so people in South Georgia, they didn't vote for him knowing he was dead. They voted for him thinking he was still alive. But turned out, of course, he didn't make it. So he has 3 years in Congress attributed to him. So that's the area. Well, here's a kid myself growing up in this area. My parents grew up on farming families. They both had 9 brothers and sisters. I have lots of cousins down here. And so we were farming families, and that was the way life was. It was a great place for a kid to grow up because there I was in the middle of nature. I could wander outside and do all kinds of goofy things, get in trouble, and I was a bit of a troublemaker. So maybe this slide illustrates that. That's me on the right over here. And I was known as a bit of a troublemaker. I like to think that I still am, if I kept a little bit of that with me. I learned a lot about risk and reward in the risk and reward equation. The reward for me was being able to stay outside more and not come home, which irritated my mother when I didn't come in for dinner or didn't show up and stayed out very late at night. The risk, of course, in those days was corporal punishment because you got paddled when you did that. My mother usually would paddle me and say, get outside, I don't want to see you for a while, which was also good for me because I got back outside, which is exactly what I wanted. But I did enjoy growing up in this beautiful part of the world and in a remarkable part of the world from a natural point of view. So let's take a look at that part of the world. It's the coastal plain. So it's distinguished in Georgia by what's called a fall line between Columbus, Macon, and Augusta. And that's where you have waterfalls because you pass out of the Piedmont soils, which are relatively hard, rocky, clayey, into the sandy soils where the oceans over time, as sea level came in, deposited sediments there. And so you have sandy soils and level flat ground in the coastal plain. But you have waterfalls along the fall line because the water then hits the soft soil and creates the fall line. So you see what the typical landforms are, tidal marshes out here on the coast, and Douglas is right over in here, so we can get over to the coast fairly easily. A lot of swamps, the great Okefenokee swamp, of course. I used to fish there with my dad. We have lots of swamps around that I took lots of time in when I was a kid, and the great pine barrens underneath the longleaf pines. And unfortunately, very few of the longleaf pines are left. And that's part of the moral of the story that I want to share with you. Coastal plain, though, very important part of this world. Oops, went too far. It's also known, incidentally, colloquially, as the gnat line. Because it turns out that gnats really enjoy sandy, moist soils. And there are plenty of them down here. And so we have lots of gnats. And just so for the record, this, Chris, is actually a specimen from our collections at the Smithsonian from South Georgia. And so it's been provided to the Smithsonian for part of their collection. Well, fortunately, they're not really that size. That's actually much expanded. But as you know, they're very irritating. They don't bite, that's the odd thing about them, but they're just there in abundance at certain times of the year. So, we're here to talk about mammals, and I want to share a little bit about that with you, and Chris helped me put this together. This little fellow over here, the southeastern pocket gopher, of course, is very active. He's a farmer. He keeps the soil tilled. He keeps it healthy. Of course, if he's in your yard, it's irritating because your yard is getting bumpy. And if you're riding horses, then you're going to have problems where they create holes. But the pocket gopher is very active and a very important part of the ecosystem in Georgia. And fox squirrels. We have beautiful fox squirrels. in South Georgia. They were very appealing to me when I was a kid, and they're abundant in South Georgia. Of course, when I talked to Chris about fox squirrels, he had to show me the collections, which Grace helped pull together. And this is the collection tray from South Georgia. And one of the things you see immediately is South Georgia fox squirrels are really colorful. And they're very beautiful creatures, very whimsical creatures, and abundant in South Georgia. And so you have blondies, you have red ones, you have black ones, black and white ones, and you have gray ones. So fox squirrels are an abundant part of the system there. The other thing I learned from Chris and in talking to his colleagues was that it's a question of migration. How do these animals get here? Where did they come from? And so we can see the animals that we have there, but where did they really come from? There's a story there, of course. And part of the story is a north-south migration story. And so when we look at muskrats, as Chris pointed out to me, there are two kinds of muskrats in South Georgia. And they are really still jockeying as to who's going to be the dominant species. So the round-tailed muskrat has come up from the Caribbean and up from Florida. So it's been coming from the south to the north. The common muskrat has come from the north to the south. And to put that in perspective, 20,000 years ago, of course, was the peak of an ice age. And when you have the peak of an ice age, there's not much places for muskrats to go other than to get away from it. And so the muskrats moved south. And South Georgia was a nice place to be 20,000 years ago. It wasn't as hot as it is today. It was more, the type of cool environment that you would find even in Canada today. So muskrats then found their way down. So migration from the north to the south, migration from south to the north. And of course, we've had migration as well from the east to the west. The west to the east. And most recently, the armadillo. The armadillo, of course, came from South America when the isthmus was created, marched across that isthmus and worked its way up north, and now gradually over to Georgia, creating enormous problems for people with their yards and for gardeners and for farmers because they really are voracious animals. Now, one of the reasons they were able to make that migration, of course, is that there are no capstone predators. Now, you know this better than I do, but then the question will become, why? Where do the capstone predators go? And why aren't they there today? And there's, of course, an answer to that question. There are some large mammals that exist in South Georgia. They were almost driven to extinction in Georgia. The black bear and white-tailed deer, which we see so many of today, almost were pushed out of Georgia in the 1930s by overhunting of the species and by habitat destruction, which was rampant in South Georgia. Fortunately, hunters and the state wildlife folks got together in a very wise way and decided that they needed these animals and that they could be hunted if you had a stable population. And today, both these animals have stable populations. They're a great example of conservation, where someone decided there was a species that should be preserved. They worked jointly with those people who harvest them, if you will, the hunters, and with those who conserve them, the wildlife protection people, and made sure these animals have stable populations, and we can see them today, the Okefenokee swamp and other areas. So that's actually a success story for conservation. If you really want to see big animals today in the coastal plain, of course you did that when you went to the White Oak Plantation. And you saw these unbelievably unusual animals, but they came from Africa. Why don't we have these animals in South Georgia today? Why do we have to bring them from Africa to see them? Where did ours go? That's the question. Of course, we know part of the answer to that. And part of the answer is, at one time, they were there. 20,000 years ago, the year of the Megafauna, we know in South Georgia that there were mammoths, mastodons, there were horses, there were great bison, there were short-faced bears, there were dire wolves. All those animals existed in South Georgia. Megatherium and so forth were there in South Georgia 20,000 years ago. And so the question is, why aren't they here today? And of course, part of that answer, let's see if I can get it. Coming back to Smithsonian collections very quickly. Our paleontologist, that's Brian Huber, working in paleontology, pointed out to me that in Dinosaur Hall, there's a creature that is absolutely not a dinosaur. It's a Megatherium, it's a ground sloth, that probably is about 12,000 years old, not 65 million years old. And that Megatherium came from Skidaway Island, right up the coast from here. It's a South Georgia guy. And 12,000 years ago, it existed in South Georgia. It doesn't exist here today, but it did then. The reason that we have that particular fossil is because a gentleman shared that fossil with us to our paleontologist from Skidaway Island, who was an amateur archaeologist, paleontologist, who collected that for us and gave it to the Smithsonian. So we know those animals existed in South Georgia, and of course they're gone. And the reason, part of the reason they're gone is climate change may have had an impact. We know the climate was warming, and that was part of the problem. But we also know that there are other creatures migrating in at that time called human beings, Homo sapiens. When they came here is a subject is still very much in question. The story that we grew up with was that they were here maybe 10,000 years ago. They came across the land bridge in Thuringia. They marched and spread out, and they came to the southeast. That story probably doesn't hold water today. We know that something quite different has happened. There is solid evidence today, if you go to the Indian Mound site, which dates far before the Indian Mound, that humans used that site as early as 17,000 years ago. And we're learning more and more. We have Smithsonian colleagues, Dennis Stanford, who would argue human beings came to this area 20,000 to 25,000 years ago. And one of the reasons we're having difficulty in finding many sites for them is 25,000 years ago, the ocean was 400 feet below where it is today. Seashore was 200 miles out. And so most of the habitations are covered up by water. And so we're still gradually beginning to discover the existence of these sites and these people. And the usual story that we're told is that human beings got close to these big animals and stabbed them, which of course is probably not what they did. They had things called Clovis points. These are not Western Clovis points, incidentally. These are from South Georgia, discovered not long ago by a friend of mine named Frankie Snow, who is a great amateur archaeologist. This is a 13,000-year-old Clovis point, 13,000-year-old Clovis point from South Georgia. And it was used to kill the megafauna when the native people attacked the megafauna. You'll see the haft of the spear went in here, and in fact, they used atlatls to throw them. And if you go to Google and see what an atlatl can do, it's pretty amazing. People can throw spears 150 yards at great velocity with great accuracy. So they didn't get close to these animals to kill them. They threw spears, and they killed them at great distance. And they brought them down, and then they killed them with their Clovis point. So human beings were deadly they're deadly efficient in their ability to kill the big animals. And of course, what we know is that 8,000 years ago, when we look at the weapons that human beings began to use, you do not see Clovis point. What you see are arrowheads, and you start to see bow and arrows. So what happened was all the big animals were wiped out, and human beings adapted a new strategy for smaller animals. So we have no capstone predators here in South Georgia, and that's why some invasive species find it easy to get into South Georgia. Let me just quickly remind you that this migration story with humans is not a constant. It keeps changing, and that's what we're beginning to learn as we study more and more habitations where native peoples live. For example, most of us grew up with this idea that there were native cultures and they built big mounds, but that is a recent culture. The cultures before that built small mounds, maybe burial mounds, maybe ceremonial mounds, but they didn't build these big mounds. This is the Temple Mound outside of Macon at the Okefenokee site. This is the Mississippian mound, the Mississippian culture. They built the Etowah mounds. They came from the west and they migrated east, and they displaced the Woodland people, the descendants of those early people who wiped out the megafauna. So you have constant influxes of different people coming in, crossing over each other, bringing different traditions. What the Mississippians brought to this area of the country was agriculture, cultivated agriculture. And they began the process of cutting down forests. So we start seeing the habitat changing again, and they had to irrigate their crops. And so they changed the directions of stream. So all of a sudden, humans now in the Mississippian culture become much more, begin to use the ecosystem in a much larger way than the people who lived there before. So very interesting conflicts of cultures. I'll just show you one more illustration of this. we go. Okay. This is a Mississippian site that doesn't have these huge mounds, but it's very important archaeologically. It's on the fall line. People love to live on the fall line because they had two ecosystems to draw from for food sources. This is in Hollywood. It's near Augusta. This is a very low mound. It's probably the end of the Mississippian culture, but very sophisticated people live there. The Smithsonian investigated this site in 1882. Harold L. Reynolds, marvelous archaeologist, investigated this site and obtained objects from this burial site, and one of them I'm holding in my hand to the right there. This is called a chunky stone. The people who were buried here were significant chiefs, and when they were buried, they took with them, they buried with these people the things that they enjoyed most in their lives. So this chief, I'm standing exactly where he was buried, took his chunky stone with him. And chunky stone was a game. And they played it vigorously, where they rolled a chunky stone out and threw spears to see who could knock it down, and they bet vigorously on this game. So this gentleman thought so much of his chunky stone he wanted to be buried with. I felt a little bad about us taking it out of his burial. It's like someone who loved golf taking their golf ball to their grave with them, and then we take the golf ball back. But so that's a chunky stone, and it's a marvelous thing. So this is 1200 year. This is the year 1200. At this point, the Mississippian culture is beginning to decline. We don't quite know why, but it begins to go into a decline. But we know what happened next. And the what happened next story is these guys. Europeans appeared. Hernando de Soto walked through South Georgia with 600 men and his horses and his hogs in 1540. And he left his hogs and he left his horses. And that's when you reintroduce horses after 12,000 years in South Georgia. So he brought invasive species, if you will, or reintroduced species back into Georgia. He also brought organisms with him, diseases, smallpox. And so the population of Native Americans declined rapidly after that. When Oglethorpe came and created Savannah, Native American culture was already in disarray, partly because of disease. And so he created a beachhead, but he didn't go much further than the beachhead in and around Savannah. But in time, European settlers pushed further and further in, and Andrew Jackson, in the War of 1812 and late 1813, the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, defeated the Creek Indians or the Muskogee Indians and said to all of them, you will go to Oklahoma. And so Creek Indians basically disappeared over the next 30 years from South Georgia. Remnants of them exist as the Seminoles and maybe the Porch Band of the Creek Indians in Alabama, but hardly any Native Americans in South Georgia, that they were all transported over. And suddenly it's the Europeans now taking advantage of that environment, not the Native American people. And with them, of course, came the next step in the story, and that is the Industrial Revolution. And Europeans now bring their machines, their automated saws, railroads, and they can cut down every tree they can see. And so in South Georgia, you lose the longleaf pines, you lose almost all the cypress trees. Today, longleaf pines occupy only 3% of the land they used to occupy. A gorgeous, beautiful tree that has an entire ecosystem underneath it. The point simply is human beings have a tremendous impact when they're combined with the tools of the Industrial Revolution. And South Georgia felt it big time. And lastly in this story, today, as that clearing process took place, bigger and bigger and bigger farms now have come to South Georgia, meaning the habitat for mammals is diminishing and being broken up further and further and further. And so it's more and more difficult to keep contiguous populations in South Georgia. And of course, this water is coming from the Floridan aquifer and it's drying upstream. This is not an irreversible problem. People are actually working to try to soften the impact of this approach to farming because it's necessary. It's the way farming works. And so we have to talk about sustainability today, and you can't take it away, but you have to talk about sustainability. So that's the South Georgia story, and really what the South Georgia story takes us to then is the next question, and that is biological conservation in the era of humans. Humans have had a tremendous impact on this area that you've had your conference in, and of course all over the world. And we today call this the era of the Anthropocene. It's not yet official in geological terms, but it's the age of humans. We're leaving marks on the Earth, will never disappear. Our plutonium impact will be measured 100 million years from now. Carbon black will be seen, and plastics. Plastics were invented in 1925. And human beings, 100 million years from now, will see plastics in the ground where we trod. So the Anthropocene represents what humans are doing to our planet. And if you think about it in the bigger picture now, so we move away from South Georgia to something much bigger. There's a wonderful timeline here in Science Magazine. And if we just look at the land-based part of this, back over here is 10,000 years ago. This is the humans wiping out the megafauna. There were about 1 million human beings on the planet at the time. We march forward to the Industrial Revolution, and there are about 1 billion people on the planet in 1800. And suddenly productivity goes up and our ability to impact our environment becomes enormous. And of course, we start using carbon fuels in a major way. And if we come up here to the present, we now have 7 billion people. We added 6 billion people in the last 200 years. It's estimated we'll add another 5 billion people. It's a hard thing to predict in the next 100 years. We cannot continue to operate in the way we got to this point. The way we got to this point is too detrimental to our planet, to our fellow creatures, and particularly in terms of carbon production. Hopefully, this period out here represents a different period. Alternative energies and different approaches to biological conservation. That's what we really are here to talk about. And of course, people are beginning to obviously recognize these impacts. Not everybody we know believes these things, but it's happening. And so we've had the recent IPCC report in 2014. We know the carbon story, that carbon was basically stable in the atmosphere. The carbon cycle was more or less quiescent and constant, about 200 parts per million carbon. And we just passed this past year 400 parts per million. And it's estimated if we could completely stop the carbon production that we've got today, it's still going to go up to 550 parts per million. And things happen at that level of carbon. Dramatic things happen. We see it at the Smithsonian in all natural systems that carbon is having a major impact on the world. It cannot be ignored. So let's talk a little bit about that. First, a little bit about history. Our friend Scott Wing, who has done this fabulous work out in the Big Basin on carbon, looking at a period when carbon went up very rapidly in the Earth's atmosphere, but no humans were there. So you don't get into that part of the argument. But in the Big Basin, you can find what he calls the Big Red deposits, and that's where 55 million years ago, you can clearly see and delineate what happened during that epoch. So here's what PETM, as it's called, the Paleoeocene thermal maximum, looked like. Huge amounts of carbon released, and eventually the oceans gave up its carbon as well as the carbon sink. Carbon levels were above 1,000 parts per million. We're at about 400 today. Global warming of 5 to 8 degrees. We've probably had 0.8 degrees C so far in global warming. Dissolution of marine chalk. That means that marine animals that make shells could no longer make shells because the ocean was too acidic. That's already happening, incidentally, in Puget Sound if you're an oyster farmer. They're having trouble with the oyster crops. And the PETM lasted a long time before the carbon cycle restored itself. So this is what it means to people in the Arctic. And it's very familiar to me. That's the Okefenokee Swamp. So no longer will I be able to say it's just down here in Georgia. It'll be up in the Arctic. That's what it looked like in the PETM. When you have that much carbon in the air, that much warming, there's no ice anywhere. Sea level is up 250 feet. Douglas is in pretty good shape. Incidentally, the cornerstone of the city is at 252. So it'll be a little bit like Daytona Beach. But the point is, you're talking about dramatic changes. And certainly for the mammals of the world, this is a dramatic change. So where are we in terms of recognition of it? Well, there's a kind of a tipping point here. When they had the summit at the UN, about 400,000 people walked down Fifth Avenue and demonstrated saying, we've got to do something about it. That never happened before. So that's a good sign. And I would encourage you to take a look at this set of reports. First, over here is the National Academy's report on climate change. There are 4 reports. This one's called adapting to the impacts of climate change. That means climate change impacts are going to happen no matter what we do, and we have to adapt to them. We have to build seawalls. We have to change the way we do business drastically if we're going to adapt to it. We've got to slow it down. That's the other side of that's mitigation. Then there are a series of adaptation reports that every federal agency was required to write. And there are some very good ones there. I just thought two of them were excellent. If you want to pull them down, you can download them for free. One is by the Agriculture Department, and it talks about our food. Where's our food going to come from in the next 100 years? And what will carbon do to our food sources? We already know there are droughts in California and other problems associated with climate change. So the Department of Agriculture, I think, is a very educational report. The other one is the Defense Department. Who would have thought the Defense Department would see climate change as a huge problem? But they do. Every one of our naval bases are in places where sea level is going to rise significantly. It's going to change the landscape drastically. These are wonderful reports to read. And I'm going to give a talk on climate change not long from now. There'll be a fourth one I'll put up here very soon, and that's the Pope's encyclical, which is coming out this week. And the Pope is going to have some very important things to say about climate change. And look at it this way. When our Defense Department and the Pope agree on something, it probably means you better pay attention. And I would suggest we as human beings need to pay attention. All right, the good news on the good news front is institutions have recognized this and are making a concentrated effort to make a difference. And so I'll show you two buildings here. I'm a civil engineer, so I had to get to this point. So this happens to be the Learning Commons at Georgia Tech. The last project I had anything to do with, that's a LEED Platinum building. It's almost a self-sustaining building, zero carbon footprint. The last building I had anything to do with it was Smithsonian, although the African American History and Culture building will come along. But this is the Matthias Lab at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, and that's a LEED Platinum building. Smithsonian had no LEEDs when I came, but now people have gotten for it. But these are simply symbols of the commitments of these institutions because they're training young people, or educating young people who appreciate the perils of climate change and know we have to do something about it. So you go to Georgia Tech today, there are 6 centers working on carbon neutral solutions. And you go to the Smithsonian today, there are all kinds of people working on these issues that we've been talking about. So that's where I feel positive. I think that our young people, the next generation, they're getting it, and they want to get it, and they want to do something about it. So that's that part of the story. So welcome to the Anthropocene, as I said. So at the Smithsonian, we had to recognize all these things and package them into our strategic approach to the future of this institution, a great, great institution. And we boiled down the entire Smithsonian, including its astrophysical program, which is the largest of its programs, running astrophysical observers all over the country, the zoo, the art museum, into 4 grand challenges. And one of them was about our planet. And that one was called Understanding and Sustaining a Biodiverse Planet. That's one of our grand challenges. And it really talks about using all the resources of the Smithsonian to address the big challenges of our environment, not just climate change, but habitat change and environmental change and all these things that go with it. And the beautiful part about the Smithsonian is it has these marvelous assets that in history have largely worked independently. But the idea now is that they will work jointly on these problems. And so you have obviously the great National Museum of Natural History where Chris works, the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute in Panama, but it will work all over the world, the great National Zoo, the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center on Chesapeake Bay, and the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute, which is connected with the zoo as the research part of the zoo. And you have these great, great assets to tackle big problems. We have collections, and that's the Natural History Museum's collections are the biggest natural history collections in the world, scientific collections in the world. These are these spectacular collections that you see on the right. These are animals from South Georgia, a possum and the raccoon. So we have huge resources to bring at big problems. And here's what we're doing. This is what came out of the plan. We're creating an international dialogue using the great convening power of the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian can call on people to come together with different views and talk about them frankly. And the last one of these that we held, and we have a series of these every 2 years, was about prospects for climate economics, health, and security. go back to those adaptation plans. So what are we doing about the things we eat, our security, our education, and our future? And what can the Smithsonian do to create this dialogue? Well, that's one of the things that the Smithsonian does well. In addition, we're going back in history through our libraries and through the Biodiversity Heritage Library. We're digitizing all previous biologically based reference materials, including field journals like Darwin's Field Journal, will be available to anybody, anywhere, anytime. And they're making tremendous progress. This has come out of our own hide to do this. But there are about 15 institutions involved with us, and the Smithsonian has the lead in this project. But beautiful website to go and enjoy it and then take advantage of the resources. And then, of course, we're working hard to take advantage of scientific breakthroughs, and so we now have an Institute for Biodiversity Genomics. Natural History has a fabulous laboratory now devoted to genomics, and we're in the process of trying to develop genome sequencing for every species on Earth, if you will, and to store cryogenically many of the tissue specimens. Next, make observations. One of the things we're missing in this dialogue, and where people get confused, is we don't have sound databases over time. Now, terrestrially, the Smithsonian has measured the health of forests in a standard protocol around the world with partners. It's a partnership of about 50 countries in the same way. And so every one of those partners gets access to that information when they put it in. It comes in exactly the same way, and the Smithsonian basically manages the database. And when we did our strategic plan, we said we really should work on the other 70% of the Earth, that's the oceans. And so we now have the Marine Observatory approach, named after a friend of mine, Michael Tenenbaum, who gave us a lot of money to endow the program. This is a genomics-based approach. So we'll develop a genome profile for these offshore sites and monitor them for years and years and years. And we have many, many partners who want to join with us. We're really just getting that going. This is Caribou Key, which is a marvelous little piece of land in the middle of some of the most beautiful reefs in the world that are endangered. And this is one of the good things I got to do as Secretary of the Smithsonian. Lovely to visit there and be with our scientists working on these big problems. So in addition, discovering and saving species, and of course Chris and his group and his colleagues are very active in discovering new species. Ricardo Martelli, I think, gave a paper here earlier today, and this is a new bat species that a golden bat that he identified. And of course Chris, in addition to discovering rats, discovered the cute Olinguito. He didn't name that one after me, he named the rabbit. The beautiful Olinguito, which is a marvelous discovery. And then saving species, Przewalski's horses, where we're working around with a coalition around the world to save Przewalski's horses, and the Sumatran tiger. There are only 500 of them left in the wild. And I got a call from the zoo director, and he said, we like to accustom them to people for just a little while when they're about 12 pounds. And he said, would you like to come out? I said, I'll be there before you hang up. So, marvelous, marvelous, marvelous little creatures. Next slide. Oh, I've got to do that, yeah. All right. Now, we felt, too, that it wasn't enough to do the science, that we had to be part of educating this next generation of young people. That's what our plan told us, is that we didn't focus on education, we weren't doing our job. So we found a great partner in George Mason University who really wanted to do that, and Steve Bonfort worked with them, and we created the Smithsonian-Mason School of Biological Conservation. And so students from George Mason, as well as any other university, can actually get involved in this program and go out to Front Royal, where we have 3,000 acres of land, and we have these marvelous scientists there, and they use this as a field site. And we built a campus there that's all built to LEED standards. Beautiful, beautiful place for educating the next generation. But students from Florida can go there and take courses there with our scientists. So we're now helping educate the next generation of scientists. Something that made me very proud as a former university person. Oh, part about that. The other thing about this business of biological conservation in the new era is you can't do it alone. The Smithsonian's a big place, but there's no way we can do it by ourselves. And you have to work with partnerships. And in this particular case, the World Bank came to us with a proposal to try to double the number of wild tigers in the wild. There are only about 2,000 of them left. There are 13 countries where they exist, different species. The 13 countries all agreed to work with us. Russia, Putin's a big fan of his tigers. And Interpol joined in. If you don't protect tigers against poaching, you're never going to save them. And so Interpol is very active now in intercepting the poachers of tiger parts. And they've already made significant progress. The Smithsonian was a founding member in this group of people working to do that. So I'm very proud of our involvement with this, and you have to have these collaborations in this new age. You can't do it by yourself, even if you're a big institution. Digital work is very important to us. We've developed, I think, a very significant three-dimensional capability to digitize fossils as well as digitize all kinds of species and share these with people. When we do high-resolution digitization, we share that. It's on our website. You can go to our website. You can download this picture yourself. Teachers can download these pictures and use them themselves with the background information that we put against them. And if you have a computer printer, you can print them out. And I have a print of this very specimen myself. But digital, use of digital computer simulations is going to be a very powerful tool to get our collections base out to the people. Come on. Okay. In addition, we also think that citizen science is very important. Getting people engaged in citizen science, and Chris and others have been involved with us on this, and North Carolina State, again, a collaboration effect. This is where young people are given trapped cameras and they go out and put them on their property or nearby parks, and they take part in the observation process, and they take the memory card and they send the information back to us. We have hundreds and hundreds of young people now participating with us in the Mammals project. So getting people, particularly with their families can get involved, but affecting as many people as possible in the conservation effort. Finally, the last slide for this part of the presentation. The others are brief. Reaching everybody. So we're using our channel, changing the nature of our channel so that we focus on biological conservation. David Attenborough, of course, is participating with us in BBC in a partnership. And in addition, we're using social media and working with edX, which is the MIT-Harvard MOOC platform. We are designing our first natural history course for the MOOC platform. We just offered up our first one in American history, 45,000 people enrolled. You can actually get a certificate if you want to pay us a little money. And if you don't, you can just enjoy and learn. But we think if you're going to impact this question of biological conservation, you have to reach everybody. It can't be an isolated audience. So that brings us to the end, and that is, how can we optimize our success? And I list some ideas that I think work for us. First, we have to rely on the science and engineering fundamentals. We have to go to the basics, and we have to do it right. Secondly, we've got to capitalize on every new scientific breakthrough, be it genetic genomics or be it digitization. Take advantage of those tools. Collaboration is an absolute key. No institution can do it by yourself. The Smithsonian is good at that because we know all the federal partners and we know many of the private partners. We can serve as a great connection point for people. Share best practices because everybody has something they've learned. Public outreach, education, using digital technology. When I went to the Smithsonian, we had no social media. When I left the Smithsonian, we had 6 million followers. People are interested in learning, and you can help them learn. And then unflagging perseverance. You cannot ever stop. It's just a powerful idea. What can you do as your organization? Keep doing what you're doing well. You're fantastic at what you do. But become informed of the larger issues, the context that we really need to address if we're really going to solve these problems. Join with like-minded collaborators. Don't be afraid of collaboration. Collaboration is a very good thing. Create your own education strategy and use digital social media because you can reach children anywhere, anytime. And they want to know what you're doing. They'll be fascinated by what you're doing, I guarantee you. Be a leader and not a follower. And lastly, biological conservation is everybody's responsibility. So thank you for having me and giving me a chance to make the presentation.